We need to muscle up. We need to psychologically be prepared for war. Not war that we're going to initiate, but war that China's going to initiate. How many more acts does it need to have? How many more things do they need to say to make it abundantly clear that they are looking for a confrontation in one form or another? You know, a few days ago was the anniversary of D-Day. And what's amazing is I spent time on this on radio, but I didn't see anybody doing anything in the news. Now, maybe there's a person here or there, but it's like it never happened. Imagine what's going on in our classrooms, those that still have school. They ignore these critical days, these critical events. D-Day was the beginning of pushing the Nazis back in Europe. Europe proper, France and so forth. And if we had failed, God knows what would have happened. And it was massive, absolutely hundreds of ships, literally thousands of planes, tens of thousands of bombs. A lot of the ships, unfortunately, overshot their targets. It was a terrible day. It was foggy. The night before, the waves were horrendous. And when they went on these boats, you know, where the front flips down, many of them were murdered, killed, right on the spot before they got off the boat. The first wave, it was a disaster in terms of casualties, but they kept coming and coming. Even though the Nazis had been fooled through disinformation, thinking we were going to land in another location, they still had their pillboxes, they were still dug in, and it was still very, very brutal. Here's the History Channel. I want you to check this out from a few years back, covering the story of D-Day and the invasion. Go.
Well, D-Day was obviously the most important single fight of that war. And of course, had we lost it, there's no telling what the outcome would have been.
Since the American entry into the war, American generals had been agitating for an opportunity to fight the Germans directly. The D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944, represented the cutting edge of this offensive.
The essential condition that underwrote the success of D-Day was the fact that Germany had been bled virtually to death by fighting on the Eastern Front for several years against the Red Army in the Soviet Union before D-Day ever happened.
The Germans had been preparing for this invasion as long as the Americans and the British had been, and they had been digging in. And they knew that they could inflict appalling casualties on the first units ashore. Well, somebody had to do it. And so the soldiers went, and indeed, those first units did suffer very high rates of death and wounding.
I'll stop for a minute. I want you to imagine that day and being these young men, knowing that it was very likely that you wouldn't live. I want you to think about what kind of human beings do that for their fellow human beings. And if you haven't noticed, the vast majority of these men, they're white and they're Christian. And we're supposed to hate white Christian men today, or call them privileged. Do they look privileged? I just point this out because it's so frustrating to me when you go to the Civil War battlefields, when you think about the Revolutionary War, World War II, which was horrific. You see it here, World War I, which was unbelievable, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and on and on and on. The people who fight for this country, the people who love this country, versus those who contribute nothing, get elected to the House and the Senate or the presidency, who really haven't lifted a finger for this country, who've benefited from all the freedom and all the opportunity this country provides, while they're trashing it and destroying it from within. When you watch this, it really frustrates you and angers you, does it not? That these men did what they did, knowing that they likely wouldn't even live. That first wave and that second wave, but especially that first wave. And when the fronts of those boats came down, many of them died right there. And by the way, the caliber of bullets being used by the Germans could go through one guy, could go through 5 guys. Boom, right at the front. and the ocean was filled with bodies, with men floating. And the beaches were filled with bodies. And you've seen these movies. When you're shot with a heavy caliber, your organs pop out of your body. It's not like it's a clean, it goes through, and it rips your body open. And it's horrendous. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., I believe he came on the first wave. Another brave, brave man. He was an older man. I believe he was in his 40s, maybe even his 50s at the time. But he insisted in participating in this. Go.
There's one thing to go on a beach with sand dunes. It's something else when you've got enemy on top of these bluffs. And for some reason, our naval gunnery was either off or something went wrong there. They couldn't destroy those gun emplacements.
But eventually, the weight of the invasion took hold. The numbers of Americans, the numbers of craft, allowed the Americans and the British to establish a beachhead. And once they established a beachhead, then they could bring more and more soldiers and equipment ashore.
Now let's stop and say, understand the terrain here. The Germans are up here. The beach is down here. It's not like when you go to a beach, you know, on east or west coast of the United States. No, they're up high, shooting down. They are built into these mountains, built into these hills with these machine gun nests and these pillboxes, these cement facilities that they have there. So it's just unbelievable. Go ahead.
One thing I don't think either the Japanese or the Germans really counted on was what it meant to come up against a massive capitalist industrial power. The ability to build stuff on a massive scale with massive numbers was just something they hadn't really anticipated.
If you look back at the old photographs and the footage of that armada out there off the coast, I don't think they've ever assembled before, after, anything like that.
Eventually, it was the technology, it was the weight of American weapons that tipped the balance. But at the very beginning, it was the soldiers.
So I want you to think about this when we're dealing with China now. China knows this. China obviously outnumbers us easily, 4 times the population of the United States. And their military, infantry, that type, is much larger because they don't take volunteers. They tell people, you're going to be this, you're going to be that. Now that said, one of the reasons that this is a really dire situation is the Chinese have stolen so much of our technology. And they've taken some of our technology and they've gotten advancements that are even beyond what we have done so far. We're very flat-footed right now and it scares the hell out of me. Go ahead.
Splashed ashore, the ones who knew that in the first wave, lots and lots of them would never come back. And those are the ones who made possible everything that followed.
The Rangers who went in first and the waves that came after them stood right up to it. And there was more bravery that day than one can hardly imagine.
Look at that. More bravery that day than one can possibly imagine. Many of you have probably been to Arlington Cemetery or some military cemetery somewhere around the country, around the world. Of course, there's the cemetery right there at Normandy. But when you walk through Arlington and you see headstone after headstone after headstone after headstone, it's shocking what our fellow man in this country has done to protect this country. And that is why Jefferson, Associate Supreme Court Justice Story, considered one of the greatest, Abraham Lincoln, Ronald Reagan, they've all said, if this country is destroyed, we'll be destroyed from within. And my concern now is we're being destroyed from within with a rising enemy, the kind of enemy we've never seen before. And China is on a mission, and they look 1,000 years ahead. And they believe that America is in decline and they are in the ascendancy. So they're a grave, grave threat. I'm very concerned about all this. I'm concerned about the way our military conducts itself under Austin and Milley, the wokeism. I'm concerned we're not meeting our numbers for recruits, not even close. In the Marines, in the Army, the Air Force, we're low on pilots. I mean, think about this. The fact is, if we're in a war, your children and grandchildren are going to be drafted. They're going to be drafted. That's why you try and avoid this. And how do you try to avoid it? You muscle up your military. You know, it's amazing. A guy wrote me 3 or 4 days ago. He saw a tweet. This Twitter stuff is exhausting, by the way. I don't recommend you get too involved in it. I try not to. Don't ever read the comments. Every moron on the face of the earth is sending you, who cares what they have to say? But this fellow worked in the Defense Department, I believe in the Reagan administration. And I said, we need to muscle up. We need to psychologically be prepared for war. Not war that we're going to initiate, but war that China's going to initiate. How many more acts does it need to have? How many more things do they need to say to make it abundantly clear that they are looking for a confrontation in one form or another? And it's likely to be over Taiwan. And I'm concerned we're not going to do much. If we don't do much, they'll take that as a message. China today claims the South China Sea. That's where they're buzzing us. That's where they're sending the destroyers to cut off our destroyers. They believe they own the East China Sea between them and Japan. They're claiming islands off of Japan that have never been Chinese and have always been Japanese. They're claiming certain islands off the Philippines. The Philippines, it's really an island nation, and the Philippines, having given us the cold shoulder about 6-7 years ago, now they've asked us to come back, and we are using 3 bases that we built in the Philippines. They're threatening Australia. They're threatening Vietnam. They're threatening Vietnam's navigable waters. They are literally attacking fishing ships that they claim are in Chinese waters. And of course, South Korea has to be very, very concerned about it too. So China, even in its own region, is really showing muscle. It has the contract to manage both ends of the Panama Canal. This is why Reagan said we must never give up the Panama Canal. Well, we did, and we have a mess, thanks to Jimmy Carter and a lot of Republicans. There are at least 27 bases of sorts in our hemisphere in violation of the Monroe Doctrine that the Chinese have use of or control. The Solomon Islands, you've heard of the Battle of Guadalcanal, where my great-uncle fought. They have a deep water port there now. Well, what do they need it for? It's in the middle of the Pacific. For us. Nothing to do with Taiwan. They have a base on the west coast of Africa. What do you think they need that for? West coast of Africa faces the United States. And so they are reaching out, and we are giving them everything they want under the Biden administration. Cobalt, lithium, cobalt coming out of the Congo. 80% of the world's cobalt comes out of the Congo. 100% of it now is managed by communist China. And I could go on and on and on about the situation in the world right now. It's dire. When it came to defense spending, as we discussed, 19% for the Environmental Protection Agency, 3% for the Defense Department. That shows you a nation that is blind, that is being pushed by ideologues. Not you and me, but Biden and the Democrat Party and so forth. We are not prepared for war. People say, look how much we spend on the military. Among those who say that are Bernie Sanders. We spend more than any 10 nations combined. What does that have to do with anything? We have a different system. What does that mean? It means that we have to pay our soldiers as badly as we pay them. The communist Chinese, they just put these people in, they work them over. Ideologically, they are controlled. They are ready to fight, and they'll get whatever the communist Chinese say. Moreover, their budget is a lie. They put out public information that's not accurate. And then the last point on this is their civilian economy and their military spending are basically one and the same. So you can't really bifurcate the two. You can't really be sure. But when you saw that video, D-Day, maybe you've seen video of other battles. Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima, and I can go on, the number of battles in World War II and the horrific casualties. Or take a look at the Civil War. Unbelievable. At Gettysburg, The casualties there are so much more when you combine even Afghanistan and Iraq and multiply it by 5. Gettysburg had more casualties. Every one of these battles, they were just brutal, brutal. You look at World War I, where they were using poison gas, flamethrowers, these trenches that were dug where men were forced to stay there months at a time, fighting over a few feet, a few yards. People would get all kinds of horrific diseases for which there was no cure, of course, or not even any treatment. World War I, World War II, the Korean War was brutal. You look at these things and you say to yourself, how can you hate this country when people have literally died all over the face of the earth in some war, some more important than others? And they put their lives on the line. They gave everything they had. Their families suffered, their communities suffered, but they felt it was the right thing to do. And then they are killed on foreign land, for the most part. No family members around them, often very young, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. I say you go to these cemeteries and you see this sort of thing, and then you have people in this country who do not appreciate it, who keep trashing us. It's really quite disgusting.
Want to see more? Sign up for Levin TV.